So welcome everybody. This is Histamine 101, the basics of histamine intolerance. My name is Lindsay Jost. I'm one of the nurse practitioners and clinicians who works at the MaxWell clinic. And I would like to wholeheartedly welcome each and every one of you for spending your time with us throughout your busy lives, whether it's live and in this moment or when you're re-listening to it at a later time. A couple of housekeeping things we want to take care of right away. I'm going to have everybody unmute unless you have a question. Please use the Q&A box, which it looks like I have one already. So I'm not able to access that. That's interesting. In the event the internet goes down, we'll switch to a hotspot, so stay on for 5 to 10 minutes and I'll hop back in if there's any reason why we need to pause what we're doing. So this presentation is going to be pretty data heavy, and so we're going to rely on our slides for most of the presentation. As you'll see, it's pulled up here. So as I mentioned earlier, histamine is a really hot topic seasonally right now. So as we moved over, I don't know if for those of you who live in Tennessee, as we moved over from the spring months into the summer, humidity tends to happen, seasonal allergies happen. If you have not lived in Nashville before and then you suddenly move to Nashville, many people talk about suddenly obtaining seasonal allergies. And what's really interesting about histamine intolerance in general, I think people get confused, is that we actually are not going to be speaking about the seasonal allergies we are so often reference when we're thinking about the word histamine. We're actually going to talk about histamine's effects on your body as a system. So let's get started. So what is histamine intolerance anyway? Well, histamine intolerance specifically is the overproduction of histamine in the body, or the inability of the body to effectively break it down. So it's not that you have a sensitivity to histamine, but it's an indication that you've developed too much of it. So that's a really, really big difference, because when people think about histamine intolerance, a lot of times they relate that to, oh, I have a food allergy or a food sensitivity. Those are some common words that we use, within our practice in our day-to-day with our patients, and that's not the case. It's essentially your body making too much of histamine, and then it doesn't know what to do with it. It can't break it down. So you are not allergic to histamine, nor do you have a particular sensitivity to it. It just means that there's too much of it and your body doesn't really know what to do. So really, really big, but super important difference when you're trying to understand what this even means. Histamine intolerance has been something that's been kind of creeping up and becoming more aware of in our mainstream health media. So it's not maybe as common as some of the other things that we've been hearing about lately, but I think it will become more and more something that we need to consider, because it has a lot of effects and it really impacts every part of how your body functions. And so therefore it's really important to dive into. So that's great, but what is histamine exactly? Let's just back up and break this down even further. So histamine is a wonderful compound. It is something to revere, not fear. It is a natural compound found within many cells of your body. In fact, histamine as a molecule is incredibly stimulating. Your body releases histamine and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm ready to go. I'm that mom that can lift the car off that baby if I need to, because your adrenaline starts to surge because it's a really big activator in your system. Most commonly, histamine can be found in a variety of your white blood cells, such as mast cells and basophil cells. So for those of you who have maybe chosen this webinar because you're interested or already know a lot about histamine intolerance, you've probably heard of mast cells before. Mast cell stabilizer, mast cell syndrome. Mast cells and histamine tend to be pretty synonymous phrases. So what that is exactly is you have red cells and white blood cells within your body. Of those white blood cells, there's different types. Different sergeants and lieutenants, so to speak, of your body's immune system. So mast cells themselves are a really big cell and they hold a lot of different components, but histamine is one of them. And so histamine is released from the white blood cells with different triggers. Additionally, histamine can even act as a neurotransmitter when released from histaminergic neurons within the synapses of the brain. So histamine hangs out in your body and it's in your cells, mostly your white blood cells. But then there's also different neurons within your brain's brainstem and central nervous system that holds little receptor sites that are specific to histamine, that when activated, histamine can have effects on your brain as well. So therefore it's a molecule that's really specific and how and special in that it can affect all these different aspects system wide. So not just the coughing, itchy eye, sneezing that you may be most familiar with whenever you think about seasonal allergies. It has a more dynamic effect on the body than I think we commonly understand. So histamine does what? Well, with the majority of histamine being located within the white blood cells of your body and the white cells being the backbone of your immune system, histamine has a role in our immune response. So when you think of histamine, think, oh, my immune system's doing something. Okay. So it communicates messages to your brain, as I just mentioned, through those receptor sites in the neurons. Whenever the histamine is bound, then certain chemical messages are sent to your brain to do certain things. Histamine can trigger the release of stomach acid to help digestion, because sometimes that is necessary whenever we're having an immune response to help the body break down anything that it's not using actively. After an injury or an allergic reaction as part of your immune system, histamine is released from the white cells and floods into the system. Why is that important? Because histamine is a signaler. It's saying, hey, help. Immune system, come, we have a problem here. We really need you to come and break down this inflammation. So redness, itching, swelling. A lot of people are aware of anaphylactic reactions whenever the throat will start to close and you get short of breath, or localized if you get stung by a bee or a wasp and you're allergic to it and you have this really big swelling going on there. That's histamine rushing into that localized site, causing that inflammation, triggering your body to white blood cells to come and save the day. Do what it does best, which is thrive and be adaptable. So when histamine gets too high or when it can't break down properly, it can affect your normal bodily function. That's the main takeaway. Oh, hey, this chemical compound has a lot of really important effects and it can really affect me and how my body works. So this picture looks a little blurry, which is unfortunate because it is so informative. I will talk it out for you a little bit. And for those of you who are not looking at a screen and maybe driving, I'll try to be as descriptive as possible. Please don't look down watching this later. So histamine is in the center, and what we're essentially saying, so there's different types. There's, H1, H2, H3. All you need to know, because we're not going to go down into breaking down the different subtypes of histamine today. That may be another webinar. But what you need to know essentially is that histamine is in the center and that all these different areas that it affects. So we've got neurotransmitter release, we've got gastric acid secretion, as we mentioned, smooth muscle contraction. It can increase estrogen, so it has hormone effects. It increases mucus secretion, so it has that sort of drainage, congestion-y feeling that you get sometimes when there's environmental allergies at play. It increases the endothelial permeability of your cells, making the cell border and wall weaker, which is not optimal or what we want. So that's something that's really impactful. Stimulates the neuroreceptor nerve cells, and so that affects your skin. We've got your respiratory tract. So the smooth muscle constriction can affect the uterus. So histamine can actually cause abnormal periods. Crazy, who knew? In the respiratory tract, it can cause congestion of the nose and sneezing, which we talked about. There's shortness of breath that can happen. That's more in the severe types of allergic responses, but it's something that histamine does nonetheless. We also have vasodilation, so it affects our cardiovascular system. We've got neurotransmitter release, so our central nervous system is a part of that too. And then different sort of bone marrow effects and leukocytes. So what you're essentially seeing here, and the point of this very complex diagram is to say histamine can have effects that you would maybe never even think that was at the root cause of some of the symptoms that you could be experiencing. So on the periphery of this, as you can see, it can contribute to nausea and vomiting and headaches and dizziness and feeling flush and abnormal periods and metabolism and diarrhea and stomach aches and cramps and these things that you go, I would never think that because I skipped a period this month, it must mean because I have too much histamine. That's the fun of really getting to root cause, which is something we really specialize in at MaxWell. clinic, as most of you know, if you're a part of our MaxWell Care program, is really digging in to the root cause of what could be going on with these symptoms you're experiencing. So what doesn't histamine affect? Well, we really didn't leave anything out. So histamine travels throughout your bloodstream and can affect your gut, your lungs, your skin, your brain, and your entire cardiovascular system. And it can be really difficult to diagnose. And that's why, because it has a wide range of problems and a wide range of things that it impacts. So it really doesn't, there really isn't anything it doesn't affect. This sounds familiar. It probably should. So you're probably most familiar with the immune inflammatory effects of histamine, as I've already talked about. Things like anaphylactic reactions, seasonal allergies. So when histamine is triggered to be released, it causes the blood vessels to swell or dilate, alerting your immune system to bring in the white blood cell artillery and defend, as we talked about earlier. So histamine causes an immediate inflammatory response within the body. So why this is important to conceptualize and just let sink in for a minute. So if histamine as a chemical compound is released in the system, it has immediate effects. So those effects can be something that is really severe, as we talked about with having the shortness of breath or throat closing in the anaphylactic situation, or it can be a slow buildup over time. So your body could get a signal to release histamine, and then there's just a little bit more in your system. Okay, and it's doing okay. It's functioning for a while, and then it gets another signal and releases a little bit more, and it's like, okay, but wait, we already had some histamine. We're still dealing with. We've not properly taken care of that. What are we going to do now? And then another one, and you can see where I'm going with this. So your total load becomes insurmountable, and therefore your body suddenly has all this histamine without the proper tools to break it down, and it causes a lot of really significant symptoms for people. So what about antihistamines like Claritin or Zyrtec? So many people are familiar with that. So antihistamines work by blocking the effects of histamine in the body. So all it's doing is blocking the symptoms that you would feel from having histamine be released. So how this is accomplished is antihistamines block certain receptors that histamine would normally bind to create the symptom cascade. So it's all of a sudden your body's going, nope, not available for that. You can hang out over here, histamine. I'm not going to recognize that you're there because I have this blocker, and therefore you're not really necessarily going to feel the effects. But the thing is antihistamines don't actually change the amount of histamine released by your body, just the symptoms you experience. So you still have all this histamine hanging out. You just might not feel all the effects of having the histamine that you used to. So as we talked about in the beginning, histamine is super activating, which is why when you take antihistamines, people often feel tired or fatigued because the antihistamine is blocking that normal stimulating effect of histamine as a compound. Just a little sidebar, but something super interesting while we're digging into what histamine is. So back to histamine intolerance. The overproduction of histamine in the body or the inability of the body to effectively break it down. So again, I am not allergic to histamine, but I have too much of it. So how does the body break down excess histamine? Okay, now I get it. I have too much of it. It's built up in my system. Okay, what's the deal? Where do we go from here? So once formed, histamine is either stored or it's broken down by an enzyme. The body doesn't have a lot of function to store it long term, so it's most effectively, the excess is broken down by an enzyme that your body naturally has as well. So histamine in the central nervous system is primarily broken down by a really fancy scientific word called N-methyltransferase, which requires something called SAMe, S-adenomethylone, to break down the detox of that. So essentially all you need to know is, okay, so SAMe is required to effectively break down histamine in the central nervous system. Got it, okay. So histamine in the digestive tract is broken down by diamino oxidase, which is DAO. DAO is the main enzyme responsible for breaking down ingested histamine. And guess what? A lot of the histamine that is coming into your system is actually ingested by the food that you eat. So not just the environment that you're in. Although being in a basin geographically like Nashville doesn't necessarily help the histamine total load. However, ingesting histamine-rich foods definitely makes a difference. So if you're deficient in DAO or diamino oxidase, you'll likely have symptoms of histamine. So supplementation with SAMe, as we talked about, in DAO is often helpful, but we'll talk about that here a little bit later. So common symptoms of histamine excess. So what does it feel like if I have too much histamine? Well, headaches and migraines. Recurrent headaches and migraines are one of the most common symptoms of histamine excess and having too much histamine in your body, which is a really non-specific symptom because headaches and migraines could be a symptom of a lot of other root causes, but interesting nonetheless. Fatigue, get really exhausted from having too much histamine. Fluctuating body temperature, flushing in the face, especially, or even body, it doesn't just have to be in the face, but that flushing feeling, especially with alcohol, most notably red wine. Red wine is one of the top offenders for being the most histamine-rich food or beverage product that you can ingest. Anxiety and irritability, like I said, it's stimulating and activating. So people have too much histamine, they're like, oh, it's just too much. Nausea and vomiting, as we talked about from our past slide. That can actually be a symptom of having too much histamine. Difficulty falling asleep and being easily aroused because of that activating chemical in your body that's just floating around in excess. It's really challenging to go into the rest and digest section whenever you're, side of life, whenever your body is constantly in fight or flight. That can cause hypertension, which is high blood pressure. Nasal congestion and sneezing, as we talked about, mucus production increases, so that's a natural byproduct of having too much histamine. Vertigo and dizziness affects the central nervous system, so fluid balance can be affected there. Having hives, that's a more common understanding of histamine. Irregular heart rate and the abnormal menstrual cycles we talked about. So a lot of these symptoms histamine can contribute to the development of. So what causes histamine intolerance, as we talked about, is the lack of the ability to break down the histamine excess and an increased histamine load. So one of the most common reasons that the body is unable to break down excess histamine is actually due to a DAO enzyme deficiency, not the need for additional SAMe, as we talked about. Well, what causes a DAO deficiency? So now I have all these symptoms. I think I might have too much histamine. I'm probably not effectively breaking it down because I don't have enough diamino oxidase. What does that mean? Well, and why does that happen? DAO deficiencies can come from a damage to the surface lining of your gut because most of the DAO enzyme is produced in the intestinal lining of a healthy gut. So what would cause DAO enzyme to not be available? Leaky gut is a huge one. Gluten intolerance. So if you're constantly having an offender or you're eating something that's causing your gut wall to be inflamed, it's going to cause the pockets to separate and not be a healed and sealed gut wall lining, which causes other molecules to come in. And so the actual villi of the gut is ineffective at creating DAO, which is what it's designed to do naturally. Small intestinal bowel overgrowth, which is a SIBO, which is a bacterial overgrowth, can cause DAO deficiencies for the same reasons. Inflammation from Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and inflammatory bowel disease. And medications, NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen and aspirin are major offenders. And these are things that people take every day sometimes. So every time you're taking that ibuprofen for your back pain, you're actually damaging the gut wall lining, which therefore means that there's a variety of things that are good for your body, DAO included, as well as having a healthy gut wall for immune function that is being damaged. So you're actually causing more long-term symptoms. It's a really tricky dance and situation. So here's a picture to kind of illustrate what I was talking about. So up on the left, you have a healthy intestinal lining in the gut, and you can see it's flourishing. It's not super puffy or inflamed. This is the most optimal environment for a DAO to be produced. You get a hit and you get inflamed for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of causes of leaky gut, and that's a webinar that we will be putting on at a different time. But if you have an inflammation, the damaged intestinal lining, as you can see to the right, doesn't have those beautiful microvilli available to be functioning well to produce the DAO. So when leaky gut happens, as you can see below, there's those gap junctions and different undigested food particles and toxins get into the bloodstream, which causes, sometimes that can contribute to autoimmune disorders and a lot of other cascading issues. But first and foremost, when we're talking about this particular topic, the diamino oxidase enzyme can't be produced in the villi of the gut, which means histamine can't be broken down. So other things that cause a DAO deficiency, DAO blocking foods. So alcohol is really big at this, as well as energy drinks and tea, at actually blocking the production of DAO within your body. And then, as irony would have it, so there's histamine modifying agents that actually affect DAO production. So how ironic is this? If you'll notice, antihistamines like Allegra and Zyrtec and Benadryl are mentioned on here. So when I take an antihistamine, I am blocking the symptoms of histamine. I still have histamine in my body, and I am affecting the production of DAO at being able to break down the histamine excess that I have. So antihistamines are really challenging, and I am not promoting not to take them. I'm merely educating as far as how tricky the effects are from a long-term perspective, because it actually can, although your symptoms are a little better, it can affect how well your body is able to break down the histamine that is still building up and occurring, because you might be blocking the DAO production. There's other things, other pharmaceutical agents like Pepcid and Zantac, some common antidepressants like Zoloft and Prozac that can affect DAO production. There's a couple other pharmaceuticals listed on here like Plaquenil and Enbrel. And then sometimes people have genetic variants that just decrease the body's ability to break down histamine that are out of their control. So, okay, this has been really informative. And now I think I might have histamine excess. What do we do about it? How do we treat histamine intolerance? Well, first thing to do is to work with your MaxWell care practitioner to find the root cause. So I would encourage you to, at your next visit, bring this up and say, hey, could this be a part of what's going on with me? I'd really like to look into this further, because as we noticed, there's a lot of potential root causes for what could be contributing to a histamine excess. And there's some tests that we offer at our clinic to check your histamine levels, specifically how permeable your gut is. And if you have an histamine excess or low DAO, we can actually measure those things. It's really informative. And so your MaxWell care practitioner can walk you down that path and really personalize the treatment plan for you to maximize your healing and well-being. So the second thing that we do is we can remove high histamine foods from elimination diet, sort of. So we take high histamine foods out for a period of time. If you're currently suffering from histamine intolerance, you may not have to avoid these foods forever, which is great. It can be a short-term solution until your histamine and DAO levels return to their optimal ranges. And depending on your unique situation, you may find that you tolerate some foods better than others that are on the list for that. So we're really about doing things for a period of time to give your body a chance to reset and optimize in the best way possible, because it already knows how to best support you and thrive and be well. So whoa, wait. We're talking about removing foods. We got to talk about this. Which foods are high in histamine? Ooh, so some of the most delicious foods are high in histamine, but that doesn't mean, again, that you're without these experiences or foods within your diet forever. This may be a short-term solution. And in fact, it may just be a fun experiment to play and run to see, hey, how do I respond? And is this something I'm actually sensitive to? So alcohol is really high in histamine. So this list of foods are the foods that they themselves, when you consume them, contain a higher level of histamine. So as you are ingesting them, you are putting additional histamine into your body. So alcohol and all fermented beverages, that includes your kombuchas and all fermented foods. So your kimchis and your sauerkraut and things like that. Vinegar containing foods, olives and pickles, all dairy and cured meats. So your turkey jerky or beef jerky and things like that. Dried fruit, so dried raisins, dried apricots, dried mangoes, smoked fish, anchovies, tuna, sardines, avocados. Avocados when they are to the point of being really overripe. Avocados that are more tough, when you cut through them, have a less amount of histamine overall. Spinach, eggplant, and shellfish. These are a list of some of the foods that are high in histamine themselves. So then we have another category that's important to be aware of. So histamine releasing foods. So when you ingest these foods, it encourages your body to release more histamine. So alcohol is on this list. I know I mentioned earlier in this webinar, but red wine is our top offender. Beer is a really big one, and champagne, those fermented alcohols, would be on the histamine containing list. Alcohol for histamine releasing would be, your distilled, your vodkas, your bourbons, your things of that nature. There is a little bit of a separation between some that have more impact than others. So histamine releasing foods include banana and chocolate and tomatoes, pineapple, strawberries, papaya, all your citrus fruits. Gluten is a big one I don't think a lot of people realize. And then walnuts, cashews, and peanuts are the top nuts that release histamine. Low histamine foods, because you go, okay, so then what am I going to eat? Well, all kinds of things. Fresh meat and freshly caught fish, all of your non-citrus fruits. You've got eggs, you've got a whole slew of gluten-free grains such as quinoa and rice. Dairy substitutes, there are so many out there now, the coconut milks and almond milks of the world. Fresh vegetables, aside from the tomatoes and avocados, spinach, and eggplant that we listed earlier. And then cooking oils such as olive oil and herbs. I invite you to celebrate and really get into fresh herbs because they have medicinal qualities. They bring food and zest or flavor to your food and zest to your experience. And they are absolutely on the low histamine food list. So going back to, okay, so that's an option. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to work with my MaxWell practitioner. Okay, got it. Then, okay, I could try removing some high histamine foods and see how I do. That's great. Other things, so healing the gut. As we saw from all of our images earlier, healing the gut is really important when it comes to histamine and histamine excess and intolerance. So it's often a long-term task because we're healing that tissue that's being used every single day. So you're going to work closely with your practitioner to get guidance in your efforts to accomplish, so your time isn't wasted. It could involve some gut rest. It could involve some specific supplementation. We personalize all of our recommendations for each of our patients, and so it will really depend on you and everything that we need to do to support you. Another thing we can do is we can add supplemental DAO, as I mentioned earlier. So diamino oxidase does come in a supplemental form. It is our product through creatinghealth.com. It is Histade. Histade is fantastic at helping really degrade food-derived histamine. Sometimes in the beginning, if we're really dealing with a strong histamine intolerance, we'll have you take that, up to 2 capsules 3 times a day before meals. It's best taken before meals so that the DAO can be in your system and then food can come in and it can help break down that additional histamine while your body and gut is healing. So we sell that online and it's a phenomenal product. Some people won't need to take Histade that long and forever at that dose, but they can then use it throughout their life as they start to integrate histamine-rich foods back into their diet. So just before you have alcohol or just before you have that piece of chocolate or something of that nature, a really ripe avocado, you'll take a couple Histade and then enjoy your meal without fear because you know that it'll be there to support your gut along the way. So other supplement things that often help is methyl donors to assist in the breakdown of histamine. So the best for this is SAMe, mentioned earlier. Others that are useful are 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate or methylcobalamin in the methyl B12 form, but the proper dosing and form that you need specifically, it should be discussed with your practitioner so they can best guide you. Our SAMe product is fantastic and it looks like this. And it is a really unique product in the fact that it is best absorbed under the tongue. It comes in little powder sachets and you sprinkle a little under the tongue. It can get a little tart and you let it dissolve and then ingest it that way. But it's a phenomenal product that has a lot of benefits outside of even just in the histamine world. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. And I hope I was able to provide some learning opportunity and welcome everybody into the world of histamine intolerance and exactly what that means and what that is, so you can have a little bit of a better idea. And I'm going to switch over to a Q&A. So I've got, could high levels of histamine over time be a root cause of thyroid conditions like Hashimoto's? You know, I think it absolutely could contribute to the development of Hashimoto's, because Hashimoto's is an autoimmune condition. And as I mentioned in the slides earlier, whenever you have that leaky gut wall and inefficient DAO production, and food particles get into the bloodstream, it can cause an autoimmune loop, and that could include the thyroid as well. So high histamine levels can contribute to your body's inflammation overall. Inflammation can absolutely contribute to thyroid dysfunction. Do natural histamine, another question, do natural histamine supplements like Nasanol or Fengray impact histamine, or natural supplements like Nasanol or Fengray impact histamine? I don't know if you mean make it higher or if help it lower, but I don't know of a direct correlation between Nasanol and it affecting lowering histamine. Nasanol is a phenomenal nasal decongestion, a lot of Chinese herbs, and that should decrease your congestion, but that shouldn't affect your histamine levels. Another question, what type of test is for histamine? Great question. So one of my most favorite tests is a blood test. It's a specialty kit. It's offered by a company called Precision Point Labs. And they take a sample of your blood, and you actually make sure you're off antihistamines for days before this test is taken. And from the blood plasma sample, it will actually measure the amount of histamine that you have within your system. It'll also measure your DAO levels, and it'll give us lipopolysaccharide antibodies. So it'll tell us how leaky your gut is. And I would definitely encourage you, if you think that this might be something that's a part of what you're experiencing, to ask your MaxWell care practitioner to about ordering that and diving into this further, because it's a phenomenal test. Could you please give an online resource for low histamine foods? Absolutely. We have an incredible histamine handout that we have through the clinic, and I will work with our team, our marketing team, to try to see if there's a way that we can make that readily accessible to everybody following this webinar. Make sure I do not have any other questions. I think we're good. Thank you all again for your time today. It was a joy to be with you. And from all of us at MaxWell Clinic, we deeply appreciate your time and participation in the community that is MaxWell Care and all the patients that we get to serve. I hope you have a wonderful day, whatever day and time this is, and we'll see you next time.